Coming up on Network Africa. Sudan's army and the Rapid Support Forces agreed to extend ceasefire by 72 hours as fighting continues in the capital. Sudan's neighbors face economic strains as they take refugees fleeing from the conflict. And World Food Programme resumes operations in Sudan after 3 of its staff were killed during conflict. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers here in Lagos. Sudan's army and the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary say they will extend a humanitarian ceasefire for another 72 hours, but fighting continues as both sides accuse the other of ceasefire violations. The truce was slated to end, but the two warring parties agreed to extend it another 3 days. The country's health ministry said at least 528 people have been killed and 4,599 wounded since fighting broke out, but the UN says the death toll could be much higher. UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths said the conflict has deepened the humanitarian crisis in the country, where a third of the population was dependent on some form of humanitarian assistance before the fighting erupted. And smoke rose over Sudan's capital skyline as the conflict showed no sign of easing. Sound of artillery, airstrikes and anti-aircraft fire could be heard in Khartoum in the early hours of today, despite a supposed ceasefire extension and the United Nations warning of a humanitarian breaking point as clashes between rival military forces entered a third week. Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands wounded since long simmering tension between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces erupted into conflict on April the 15th. Many fear for their lives as Sudan's two most powerful men prosecute a war in a country that has faced civil wars, coups and economic hardship for decades. Meanwhile, people in Khartoum rushed to shops as grocery stores partially opened early today, shortly before fighting started again. The army said it hopes what it calls the rebels would abide by the deal, but it believed they had intended to keep up their attacks. However, the sound of artillery, airstrikes and anti-aircraft fire was audible in the capital. So far, the clashes have left more than 500 dead and over 4,000 wounded. And the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is scaling up efforts to assist people fleeing from Sudan and seeking safety and asylum in neighboring countries such as Chad. In Chad, the UN Refugee Agency and its partners have deployed emergency teams along the eastern border with Sudan to respond to urgent needs for protection and humanitarian assistance. The clashes in Sudan might trigger intense displacement both within and outside the country. The government of Chad and the UNHCR have initiated pre-registration activities to identify new arrivals and assess their needs.
UNHCR's strategy here for the response is first to assist people coming to make sure that the welcoming process is well done. First point. The second thing, to ensure that all the protection concerns are clearly understood, then addressed. So we have deployed a lot of staff for the registration, which is key for the beginning of a response. We need to know the nature of the people we want to support. So registration is the first activities ongoing. And secondly, we are trying to make sure that we have a proper border control movement to have the incoming new people incoming in the border so that we can monitor also that situation. But third is the assistance in terms of water, education. If we fail to act now, it will be too late. The rainy season is coming in few weeks, and if we don't provide any assistance to the people, the road will be blocked, and all the refugees here will be stuck. And we definitely need to provide assistance in terms of water, health, and shelter as quickly as possible, in order to food also, in order to ensure that people are safe and protected.
Meanwhile, families fleeing the conflict in Sudan arrived at a United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees assistance camp in neighboring Chad as the refugee agency increases its presence for displaced people in the region. Many refugees arrived at the camp in Mijilita on foot, carrying few personal belongings, while others used horses and donkeys to travel across the Sudan-Chad border. Several arrivals at the camp received medical attention from aid workers, while others were able to fill canisters and containers with water from a nearby truck. Since the beginning of the fighting, at least 20,000 refugees have fled across the border into Chad. And a land crossing on the Egyptian side bordering Sudan was witnessing a surge of people fleeing the conflict-ridden country, with busloads of anxious travelers enduring a long and uncertain journey as they look to escape from the fighting. Thousands of Sudanese and foreign nationals are escaping the violence in Sudan through the land border crossings of Gustol and Ardin. Travelers are forced to spend days on the Sudanese side until they sort out their entry to Egypt. Gustol is just a 15-minute ride from Wadi Halfa, the closest city in Sudan to the border. There, people can find more humane conditions during their long wait to enter Egypt. And Sudan's neighbors are facing economic strains as they take in refugees from that conflict. In Chad, people are seeing the cost of goods rise by as much as 70% in a matter of weeks. Adam Ibrahim Dahab, a resident of Adre, said that it's getting difficult to afford 4 meals a day. Bishara Ishak, a Sudanese refugee and trader in the border city, said anyone with stock will now try to sell at a higher price. In South Sudan, the influx of refugees is also putting pressure on scarce resources. Let's get more on these. The VOA's Mariama Diallo joins us from Nairobi, Kenya. Mariama, welcome to the program today.
Thank you, Joke, for having me again.
I'm happy to be here. What's the update for today? What can you give us from all the happenings for today?
Well, I guess the short answer is that there is no ceasefire. The ceasefire has not been, is not holding once again, as we've noticed since the beginning of the war. I think at some point, you know, maybe they'll give it a rest for the word ceasefire itself, because from the beginning, every time it gets extended and then fighting continues. So that's the short answer. But I think that the new development, I think, you know, from just the international community, from all the actors who have been trying to broker peace, to try to have the generals respect a ceasefire, at least, you know, from the head of the United Nations in Sudan, who has recently relocated to Port Sudan. I think he's, you know, been asking the warring parties to kind of respect the ceasefire and things like that. But I think recently what he said was that he thinks efforts are on their way to actually maybe have representatives from both parties, meaning from the Sudanese Army General and also from the RSF camp, to actually meet in a neutral country, in a third country for negotiations. So I have a feeling that that's in the works, and obviously efforts have been made since the beginning for that to happen. But I have a feeling that there is development on that once he talked about it recently.
Right, so what options are there for the refugees? Thousands are fleeing the conflict in Sudan. Some are headed to Egypt. Others are going elsewhere, like we reported. Some are going into Chad. but there are delays and people are running out of food, they're running out of water. So what are their options?
Well, I think at this point, given the, how intense the clashes have been, how just dire the situation has been, I think, we know that Sudan has 7 countries bordering it. But I think the people who are fleeing are basically calculating what is the safest way to go, without getting killed with you and your family. So far, it's been obviously Chad, where the UNHCR recently has, scaled up its work there to try to help the government welcome these refugees and give them obviously life-saving and life-saving materials or just helping them, welcoming them in a border in a neighboring country. And South Sudan is doing the same thing because it's also right there on the border. And the thing with South Sudan is also Sudan had refugees from South Sudan who lived in who were harboring in Sudan, but now had to go back. So South Sudan has that, and then added to that are the newest refugees. Egypt is another one which a lot of people have been going to. You mentioned Port Sudan, which also a lot of people, and it's not easy to get there. I'll give you an example. One of our reporters on the ground did the trek last weekend, I think, and it took hours. And I think at some point in his report, he said, he was explaining that they went through a lot of checkpoints, and some of them were from the Sudanese army. The other ones were from RSF. And he said everything was fine, everything was peaceful. But he said at some point at their last checkpoint with RSF, in the bus, basically the bus started going, and then 2 tires basically had 2 flat tires. And then the bus driver only had 1 spare. So they fixed that tire and they waited on the road until somebody else was driving, a good Samaritan, who helped them kind of fix that tire. And it's very much also little things like the bus that doesn't have 2 spare tires. And it's just
well, thank you, Mariama, for that update from Kenya, where you are located. And please do keep safe. I know there's the border there between Kenya and those fleeing Sudan, the Sudanese crisis. Welcome back to the program. The World Food Programme is resuming its operations in Sudan after a suspension where 3 of its staff were killed during the conflict. Many aid groups have not been able to operate since the conflict broke out, and the first international aid has arrived at Port Sudan. The United Nations said it's working closely with Egyptian authorities to help people arriving at the border escape the conflict in Sudan after complaints the international response to the crisis had been lacking. And the International Committee of the Red Cross has delivered a first international shipment of humanitarian aid to Port Sudan. The 8 tons of humanitarian cargo includes surgical material to support Sudanese hospitals and volunteers from the Sudan Red Crescent Society who are providing medical care to people wounded in the fighting. The medical shipment also includes anesthetics, dressings, sutures, and other surgical materials. Hostility is still ongoing. ICRC teams will need guarantees of safe passage from the parties to the conflict to deliver this material to medical facilities in locations with active fighting, such as Khartoum.
No one has managed to get medical assistance into the country, which is badly needed. This medical assistance will hopefully travel quite quickly from Port Sudan, delivered to the hospitals that are in most need. And that requires indeed a ceasefire that should be respected by both sides for us to be able, with our colleagues from the Sudanese Red Crescent, to deliver these items as quickly as we can to the hospitals and allow the medical personnel, doctors and nurses, but also first aid volunteers to do their job. Because for now, as much as they're trying, people are extremely disappointed because no one, unfortunately, is able to build a strong humanitarian response as it needed. Since the 14th of April, the number of casualties has only increased because the fighting is happening in densely populated area in a capital of 6 million people. The World Health Organization has reported over 4,700 injured with almost 450 dead. And these require indeed medical assistance, but also require a strong and steady, but also a professional dead body management. And I hope this will be only the first of a number of batches that will come, will be extremely crucial for the hospitals to be able to cater for the needs of thousands of people that are flocking to their doors and waiting to get medical assistance.
The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is sending his emergency relief chief, Martin Griffiths, to Sudan amid the unprecedented situation there as the country's warring factions continue to fight, despite saying they would extend a barely respected 72-hour ceasefire that was due to end at midnight. According to a statement, Martin Griffiths says Sudan's humanitarian situation is reaching a breaking point and essential items were becoming increasingly scarce, especially in Khartoum. Mr. Griffiths adds that the people are struggling to find food, water and fuel. The rising cost of transport is also making it impossible for the poorest to reach safer locations. He said he's on his way to the region to explore how to bring immediate relief to the millions of people whose lives have turned upside down overnight, reiterating the need for the fighting to stop. Well, the National Association of Nigerian Students in Sudan says all stranded students in the war-racked North African country have been evacuated from the country's capital, Khartoum. The public relations officer of the association, Amal Pantami, made this known in a statement on Sunday. He said, according to him, this is to inform the general public that all the remaining Nigerian students have been evacuated from Khartoum today, Sunday, 30th of April, 2023. There were a total of 26 buses, and each bus contained about 50 people. He said, we continue to ask for everyone's prayers, and we hope all the students are able to reach Nigeria safely. We're ever grateful for your continuous support and prayers. Earlier, in a tweet, the chairman of the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, Abike Dabiri-Rewa, also confirmed that the borders between Egypt and Sudan were open for passage for nationals trying to cross from Sudan into Egypt, and that there was progress in the evacuation process. In other stories in Africa, Ethiopian security forces say they have arrested 47 suspects after the murder of a leader of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's ruling party, accusing him of plotting to overthrow the regime. Germa Sheshtila, leader of the Welfare Party in the recently troubled northern region of Amara, was killed with 4 others in an attack. Security forces said that the 47 people arrested are suspected terrorists and were found in possession of weapons, bombs and satellite communications equipment. Meanwhile, security forces explained that the suspects worked together locally and in foreign countries with the aim of taking control of the regional government in order to overthrow the federal government by assassinating senior Amara officials. Residents and survivors of an alleged massacre in a Burkina Faso village say at least 136 people, including women and infants, were killed as they blamed security forces for the attack. Prosecutors launched an investigation into the massacre, which took place in the northern village of Kama and the surrounding area after reports that people wearing the uniforms of the Burkinabe armed forces had killed about 60 civilians. The NGO said that the assailants also killed 11 people nearby the same day, 6 in Dinguri village, 2 in Mene, and 3 on the road between Wahiguya and Barga. The attack, one of the worst on civilians as the country battles rebels linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, has provoked condemnation and calls for an investigation by the United Nations Human Rights Office. Burkina Faso is one of the several West African nations struggling with rebellion that has spread from neighboring Mali over the past decade, killing thousands of people and displacing more than 2 million. The military government has launched a large-scale offensive, which it said is aimed at reclaiming swathes of territory controlled by armed groups. And finally on the program, Guinea's international sports stadium buzzed with people seeking a different kind of work this week, well, a different kind of workout, as minds flexed and stretched in pursuit not of muscle gains, but literary enrichment. The 15th edition of Guinea's 72-hour of the Books Festival unfolded in venues across the capital, Conakry, bringing together a wide array of writers, publishers and readers from the West African country and across the continent.
The annual three-day event is aimed at celebrating books and promoting literacy in a nation where over half the population is illiterate. According to World Bank figures, and access to libraries is limited. According to World Bank figures, and access to libraries are limited. Despite its low literacy rate, Guinea boasts a rich literary heritage and more than a dozen publishing houses. Most, however, struggle for funds to undertake large production runs. Those that do tend to focus on foreign works. But Conakry's arena transformed into a haven this week for readers clamoring to meet their favorite local authors, writers seeking to expand their audiences, and budding creators who took part in workshops.
Learning things with games, creating stories with things you yourself create in your own imagination. That's what I like, and that's what makes me come here. I like it too much.
Spread across broad tables, works in French, English, Fulani, and a cross-section of local languages draw festival goers to local authors like Ousmane El Haj, who for the last 3 years has used the festival to reach new readers.
That's the program today. Thank you for watching. I'm Jokia Rogers.